Let's begin. If you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Anyone else want to speak on item number 2? Okay. Thank you. Okay, any... Thank you. Anyone in the audience have anything that is not on the agenda that they wish to discuss? Okay, I'm going to close public discussion. Okay, minutes. You know, it's a good one. This is the few times that all 7 of us are present. Right. Thanks, Sally.
I'd like to make a motion, Commissioner, that we approve the minutes unless somebody has a correction.
All right.
I actually had a comment about the minutes.
Good.
Turn on your mic. 1 second. Jerry, push your mic button.
Mine's on it. There you go.
I wish I had my actual minutes.
Could there be a second so that then you can comment on the corrections?
Yeah, do I hear a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Comments?
So I think these minutes are really lacking. We had a 3-hour meeting, and we went over issues that are really important, and that people spend a year working on, and there's no reflection of any actual opinions. And
So, Jerry, can you hit your mic off because it's echoing?
in the minutes. And I feel like the minutes aren't just supposed to identify the people that were at a meeting, but to be like an executive summary of what happened and what was said. Like if a year from now they revisit this, no one's going to have any idea what the PTC or City Council reviews it, what our opinions were. And I feel like there was, 14 members of the public strongly against this. There was commentary from each of us strongly opposing each of these, and it's just, you would never know that from these minutes. And I feel like they just don't, other than, establishing who was there, they don't really.
So I would agree.
do anything.
Is that a challenge for you guys and staff?
Well, we were always discussing minutes as being action minutes, and in fact, there wasn't any action. So really, if we want to have better records, that's going to be something we probably should ask staff and council about, because the minutes have always, since time immemorial, been action minutes.
And I noticed that when, in our packet, when we went through stuff, it's just what Renee says. I have no idea what was said, what the implications were. It'd be nice if there was some way to. So I'll leave it.
As Commissioner Bresnick pointed out, the minutes are action minutes, and we get our direction from our city clerk and city council in terms of the forms of the minutes. I think the backup to the written minutes, though, are the videotapes and recordings that we have, so we can actually go back, if need be, to put into print what actually was said and took place at a Planning and Transportation Commission meeting.
I would, but, in the past, when we have a controversial issue, it will at least say 14 spoke in favor, 1 spoke against.
2.
Each of the commissioners were, not supportive. I feel like just that most basic description at a very high level has to be included in minutes. Because you have to decide what your minutes want to be, but I don't think these are helpful without that information.
We can take
But
a
I
look at
understand,
that.
it's not supposed to be a record. We have the record, we have
Right.
the public record, but it should be a summary. I don't think it does that.
And some of that is in our packet for, the follow-up discussion that we'll have tonight.
Yeah, we'll have
So,
tonight, right.
Yeah, it does say, based on discussion, there appeared to be a consensus among PTC that it could not recommend changes.
Right, here's what
So,
was said, here's what is said. So.
That's not in the minutes, though. You're
Right.
Totally correct.
But also, like, when someone opposes or supports something, we say the reasons why. We don't have to say every reason, but there should be a very high level
Maybe this is
explanation.
something we can bring up at our next joint session with City Council, because it is directed from City Clerk and City Council to him. So do we get a call for the
I don't know,
vote?
staff was talking. I was curious what.
Well, I was just wondering because Commissioner Bodnar brought up an interesting question about should they at least reflect those that spoke and expressed concern or support or opposition to something. And I was just checking with Mr. Cornfield to see if the council minutes had at least that level of detail in the minutes. And we're just taking a quick look right now. But it looks like their
They do.
minutes are very summary as well.
Yeah, I don't think they
that
do
level
either.
of detail.
So I would support that the next joint commission meeting we have with city council, we bring this up. I think it's an important thing about at least saying how many pros, how many cons, so that somebody gets a sense of what the meeting was like.
Call for the vote?
Well, okay. Any other comments? Then I'll call for a vote about approving the minutes.
Well, if we're going to, since we're making comments, I will add.
Yeah, we are, that's what, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of listing people who made public comments under item number 2 last time, it was kind of a weird, it called some people residents and some people downtown property owners, but I happen to know that at least one of the residents is a property owner and was not identified as such, and, so it's almost just easier if you're just going to list people to just list or include each and every person's affiliation, which I think is just kind of long. So I just thought the delineation was not correct in some cases.
Okay, any other comments? Okay, well, we have a,
Motion on the floor.
okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Opposed.
And one abstain.
And one abstain. Okay?
So we have
5,
5
1,
yeas.
and 1.
5, 1, and 1. One abstention and one
No.
vote.
Opposition.
No,
Was five.
one opposition, one member that abstained because I weren't present
Right.
at the meeting.
Okay. Item 2, continued discussion of the height limits for CD and CDR3 zone district, roof structure classification and height limits, amend design review findings, and D, add definition for penthouse and tower to Title 14, zoning of the Los Altos Municipal Code. Mr. Biggs.
Thank you very much, Chair Moyson, members of the Planning Commission. John Biggs with the Community Development Department. You last took up the recommendations of the Downtown Buildings Committee at your meeting on September the 1st. After a lengthy discussion and a lot of public comment, you requested that staff come back with several items for you to take a look at, along with some recommendations in terms of the proposed ordinance changes that you reviewed at the last meeting. We've included in your packet those modifications to the code. We are bringing back to you some information regarding how the city arrived at the 45-foot height limit. There is a staff report from October of 2012 that provides a lot of background information for how the city came up with the 45-foot height limit for the CD and then sequentially the CDR3 zone districts. We also provided 7 sheets of information regarding recent projects in the downtown that have been approved and constructed. One caveat to those sheets I'd like to point out is that prior to, I think it was 2012, there was a different method for measuring height. So when you take a look at some of the height limits that are identified in the zoning code or the zoning section of those project information sheets versus the actual height of the building, you'll notice a difference, and I think that difference is described or can be explained by how we used to measure height in the downtown. You also requested that the city's economic development manager be present at the meeting this evening, and that's Ms. Jennifer Quinn, who is here with us at the staff table. As I mentioned, we did provide in your packet information regarding the 45-foot height limit, along with information on the 7 projects in the downtown. There was a modification requested by the Planning and Transportation Commission for roof structure classification. You wanted to see the term tower retained in subparagraph A, which we have done here and highlighted in the overhead as part of the Planning and Transportation Commission packet. You also requested that we come up with a proposal for a change to the height in the roof structures for penthouse or structures that enclose a stairwell. Our recommendation was that a new code section be implemented that allows the height of these structures to be no more than 12 feet, which sort of reflects the minimum height of the first floor for structures in these zone districts. Requires that the structures be compatible architecturally with the rest of the building. Requires that they be a minimum size so that we don't really touch on the maximum area of the roof that they cover. Rather, it's regulated by our building code requirements for providing that minimum access level, and making it clear that these roof structures cannot be used for providing additional storage or floor space for the buildings that they're on top of. Definitions, you had a suggestion for a change to the definition for tower, and you can see here highlighted is the last part of that sentence that has the strike through. We would eliminate that if you make this recommendation onto the City Council. Also, with the design review findings, there was some concern with the language and what the findings were trying to achieve. So in the highlighted areas, staff has inserted some additional language that hopefully helps clarify what the that portion of the design review findings is trying to achieve. And that was the last of the changes requested by the Planning and Transportation Commission. We'd be happy to answer any questions that you have, and I'll pull up on the screen the downtown zoning map so you know where the CDR3 zone districts are, along with the CD zone district that you're covering this evening.
So, Chair, I have a question for the staff. Actually, two.
Okay, go.
So, first of all, I appreciate what you guys put together because it was great to read through, and I really was helpful in trying to understand the complexity of all this. One of the questions I had was regarding Appendix B. I noticed that 81 3rd Street was not listed at all, which I was surprised because that's a recent building. It happens to be in one of the areas that we're talking about the height limit, and I'm surprised that you guys didn't. And I don't know if that was an oversight. It's the place behind.
That's a project for which it's a recently actually granted occupancy to, but we had not prepared that data sheet for that.
Yeah, because I was curious what height and stuff.
We can certainly get that information for the commission.
So my I have three actually now the more I talk. The other question I had was when I was looking at the height for 400 Main Street, it says that it's 30 feet, which I assume is to the roof deck. And it's 47 and a half feet at the highest point, and I assume that's the tower? Am I thinking that right?
This building was under the old height limit, where
Right.
it's 30 feet to the ceiling of the
Oh,
second
so it's 30.
story.
So what should be here is a note like you had at Safeway that says it was approved when the height was blah, 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 blah.
When it was measured to the interior ceiling height
Exactly.
rather than to the highest point on the building.
Yeah, so the roof deck is actually 47 and a half feet.
And
The roof deck or the tower?
I think it would be
Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
It's the
Yeah,
tip of the tower, right?
The tip of the
Yeah,
tower is
the
47 and a
very
half,
tip
but
of
I was
the
curious what the
tower
roof deck was.
It's actually the midpoint of the tower.
Gotcha.
Because it's a
Sloping-
sloping surface.
Yeah, but what's the roof deck?
I don't know.
Okay, so it would be great in Appendix B for 300 Main that you would put a note there that it was proved based when it was on interior, and then two, that what the roof deck was, because I think this information was gratefully helpful to reflect on different things. My other question happens to be on the staff report in the buildings and heights. The last sentence says, other alternatives for height limits, blah, 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 blah.
Blah, blah.
Yeah, blah. It has a whole bunch of stuff. It's the first paragraph, last sentence, but we're not explored. And so my thinking was that you wanted to send us a message about what we should have been thinking, or
Well, I think it was just to relay to the commission that staff presented one alternative to the recommendation by the Downtown Buildings Committee, and I just wanted to point out to the commission that we really didn't talk about any alternative ways of measuring height, whether it be for taking a closer look at requiring setbacks from the building or from the property lines as the
Yeah.
building got above certain heights. I think there were a couple Planning and Transportation Commission members that discussed or mentioned that, along with something like maybe aggregating lot sizes to create larger sites on which
I
the larger
appreciate you
building might-
mentioning that because it made me think about other things in different ways. So I just wanted to point it out to other people. Thanks. That was all my questions.
Any other questions for staff? Sally? Get there after.
So in addition to the Third Street development missing, the hotel is missing too. So I would like the fact sheet on that one.
Okay.
With the same kind of footnoting, because the
Analysis.
footnoting is very, very helpful. Then
Okay.
my question was, and I think you've addressed it, but I didn't quite understand how it addresses, so maybe you can help me, which is that you talk about alternatives to the 4% of the building's roof area limit when we're talking about the elevator shafts and stairwells. And you said that's accommodated by saying that such structures shall not exceed the minimum size required by Title 12 of the Municipal Code. So how does that work? Can you help me?
Well, Title 12 of the Municipal Code is our building code regulations, and for stairwells and landings for stairs and the distance of the stair width along with the requirements for an elevator tower component, there are minimum building code requirements for providing the appropriate widths to the stairwells and construction materials on the exterior. So we were trying to tie the area that these structures could occupy to a building code requirement and not allow someone to make these additions to a roof any larger than they needed to be. So
Right.
let's say our building code requirements said that a stairway had to be 3 feet and the walls needed to be 6 inches thick on either side. You could do the math and come up with the exterior.
Right, what it needs to be. So
Right.
that's what I thought it was going, but what that then doesn't, my question remains then, if I'm remembering correctly, we're still echoing here. I'm not sure what's doing it.
Still getting some
Um,
feedback on
The, that's a little better. Yeah, whoever fixed it.
The control guy fixed it.
Okay, good, thank you. If I recall, at the 5-story El Camino project, the project hit 6% because it was counting decorative trellising for a sort of a rooftop deck. So that, to me, I don't understand then how this building code definition, I see how it works to the stairwells and elevator, but it seems to leave out the trellising component. That wouldn't be, it wouldn't be included. And the only reason that project hit 6%, if I recall, because it counted the trellising. So to me, this maybe doesn't quite do the trick, but
Well, in that case, the trellising didn't count towards that 6%. What counted towards the 6% were the 2 elevator enclosures, the stairwell enclosure, plus because they had those amenities on the rooftop, they actually had a separate enclosure or area where they were keeping trash. And so rather than having a trash chute that went down to the basement level, they had a place where they could collect trash on the rooftop and then carry that down through the elevator system to the
okay, so it
trash
wasn't,
below.
the trellising itself wasn't part, I'm remembering it wrong then. So it was simply because they're going to be hanging out there, then the trash receptacle thingy. Okay.
That was one
Thank
of the
you.
amenities that developer
Okay.
included in his
All right,
project.
great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I would just ask that for all of these, we try to understand what actual means. And so maybe there should be, just by a layman's understanding of what, to the top of the to the top of the roof deck, and then to whatever, however you measure the tower, but not to the, I've never seen a definition of to a ceiling, so it seems to make no sense. So I think
That's why it got changed.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
But measuring to that now still doesn't make sense. So that would just be helpful if we revise this to present the information that way. And then
do that.
by changing the definition, do we have a sense of how many buildings, if any, are now non-conforming?
I don't have a definite sense of how many buildings would become non-conforming if the height were changed from 45 feet to a lower point.
Or
Well-
just in the way that the definition is
What I was going to say is 400 Main and Safeway are definitely
Non-conforming.
non-conforming to the
Non-conforming.
current height limits because they
If
have
they were
footnotes
ceiling.
underneath, because they were measured to the ceiling, not to the roof deck. So
Right.
they built them to the ceiling, which didn't make sense.
Under a different set of zoning standards.
Exactly, but
Well,
the rest
but-
of the buildings are in.
But I don't know if Alex was asking if the change were made, what buildings in town would become non-conforming, or was he asking what's non-conforming at this instant because of the last change?
It was a two-part question.
Got it. Gotcha.
Yeah, it's the first one being just what, existing, based on just purely the change in definition is non-conforming, and then obviously secondly, if we were to change heights, what would be non-conforming? Because I think that has a lot of repercussions to existing building owners. I've personally gone through it. If something were to happen to that building and you try to rebuild it, you're now prevented from doing so, and you've got to, either buy insurance or take the risk. And there's just a lot of other things that the public may want to also be aware of or consider.
And Jennifer might want to weigh in on that one at some point, too.
I can list those buildings if you want. 100 First Street, the 48-unit condominiums would be non-conforming. The office building on the other end of First Street that's under construction would be non-conforming. The 20-unit condominium where the old Adobe Animal Hospital will be non-conforming. And the mixed-use building at 243rd Street would be non-conforming.
Wouldn't the Packer Foundation also be non-conforming because it's at 32 feet? And if the height was...
To the midpoint,
Yeah.
in the
Packard was
And
different.
81 3rd Street? 'Cause it's
86 3rd Street, yes.
86
Yes.
And the hotel.
in the hotel.
Name any other big buildings in town?
Now what you done?
Yeah.
Well, the hotel would not be affected. They're different districts.
I don't.
So I will concur with Alex. I thought I understood what the highest meant, but I think when you were answering Mike's question, now I'm not certain. When you wrote here, like at the highest, like from a layman, is that the tippy top or that's the now highest measurement? Like I'm just looking at 467 First Street. Midpoint is how we measure it now, is how I understood it, and 46.4 at the highest is like what a man on the street looking up, and he looks at the top point, what they think.
But what, on this 467, that's referring to the
David, do you have your mic on?
upper shed roof on the third floor.
So it's the highest
Upper
point, that's the highest point.
of that. But on 400 Main, I think we were referring to something different, so your point's well taken.
Right, that's when so then I thought, well, what really is the tippy top, which is just not what I'm going to say because I don't know any other, like we say highest point, but it's apparently not the actual highest point. So this leads me to the next point, which is I think we would benefit from like agendizing a discussion about what is height, different roofs, how we measure it,
What's actually in the report?
because
It's in Exhibit A.
I know. I just don't think we're like when we're all asking questions. Well, what does this mean? The highest point. I don't think we don't get it. And
And we can certainly come back at a later meeting and have a
Yeah.
discussion about height. I think this gives you a taste of how complicated
Yep.
height. I mean, it seems like it would be a pretty easy question to answer. How tall is a building? You look to the highest
We
point of the
actually did
building
that
and
in
you
2012,
measure down. But
remember.
there's been a number of different ways the city has measured height over the years that add to the confusion. Even for the project at 4880 El Camino Real, the overall height of that building as initially proposed was 72 feet, 73 feet, which we were measuring to the very highest point of the structure, which was at the points where the elevator towers were at. But if you looked at just the principal mass of the building, it was quite a bit lower than that.
Right.
So,
but like I think if we actually knew what the real highest point of 400 Main, we would have a better understanding of what is too much. Like, we understand what the objections are to some of the buildings on First Street, but we don't know what that number actually is because this was a conforming building at the time it was constructed. But in order to understand why people have, this objection to height, we need to know what the actual height is that they are objecting. So,
Well, it
So
should
maybe
be-
it's to the actual physical
Right.
highest
So
point.
that's what I
and
think we
then,
need to know.
And then also just by definition to, if it's sloped, to the midpoint of
Right.
the.
Well, and
So my
actually, and
suggestion-
John made a good point too, which is if there's a principal mass, and that's what the perception is from street level, then you could say from the tippy top of the tower is X. The principal massing, which is the top of the roof deck for the volume, is Y.
Right.
And we measure the slope section that's off to one side at the midpoint, and that's Z. Because it's not easy, John.
Yeah. It should be simple to put in that, the highest point is measured at, as you're saying, and under the Packard Foundation, it just says 32 feet, and it doesn't say anything about the highest point, and so I'm assuming that's the midpoint of the sloped roof. But, so again, where is that 32 feet measured, and what is the true highest
So what-
point of height?
So what we're saying is Appendix B has had a lot of information. It's very informative, and all we'd like you to do is help us understand
Parse
some of the
it.
dimensions of it, because I think this could be, as we mentioned at the last meeting, a basis. So anybody has a conversation, we can pull up the fact sheet and say, here we go. Here
Yeah,
are the
exactly.
structures. Here's what they look like. We all know it. We're not talking about, well, I think it's 100.
And we can certainly provide that information to the commission, but I think this gives you a taste of what some of the past projects and heights are, and the various
What-
ways we measured heights. I think the major question before the Planning and Transportation Commission this evening is whether or not the height should change from 45 feet, however that gets measured, down to 30 and 35 feet.
Right. What I'm saying is this Appendix B could be a fact sheet that anytime anybody talks about height, we just pull up the fact sheet. Nobody's going to dispute it. We're all going to look at it. We're going to review it, and
Right.
we're going to say,
Well,
okay.
but John's
There's
right.
people-
I mean, in fact, this
for the
is a good
conversation,
start.
right.
But what we're looking for is to parse it just the next step down, so we have an additional tool for the future.
Right.
But this is, for the purpose of tonight's discussion, good job.
Right.
Yeah, no,
But I-
by the way, good job.
Yeah, I would also say, like, when you're deciding between 45 and 30 feet, you're looking at what is 45 and 30 feet, and if people are saying, well, I really don't like the Main Street, 400 Main Street, and Safeway building, and we tell them that's 47 and a half feet, but in fact it's like 51, right? Then their objection really isn't to 45 feet; it's to it could be 50 feet, it could be 55 feet. So,
Yeah.
in order for the next body to make this decision, I feel like they need to know what the objection is really to, like, because those were the two buildings that were, it felt like, referenced the most as the basis for people not following our codes. And if in fact those blow past 45, then they should know that. Another question I had, one of the things that, this 2012 change where we measure the building height from the plate, this halfway, that, I think
Confusing at best.
it almost felt like in 2010, and this is so helpful to read this background because you see why they did it, and they explain their motivation is to increase, retail activity, and they wanted more vibrancy on First Street, and they were like describing it as this like in need of redevelopment, and it accomplished what the intended purpose was, for better or worse, to different people in town. But like in 2012, it went from 35 and sometimes in 40 feet to 45 feet in 2010. But then in 2012, we did this other measurement, and it kind of pushed things back down because that plate is lower than the measurement that was. So it was like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and I don't think people quite understood that was what that was accomplishing. Which is why I feel like I want to kind of have a revisit it. And the question I was going to ask is, in the rationale for measuring it from the plate, we say that it would be beneficial, that by doing it this way, I think it will encourage sloped roof buildings. And my question is,
Why?
after 4 years of having seen this in action, has it accomplished its intended purpose? I'm not asking you to answer that right now, but I would like to, a more sort of thoughtful, when you look at the projects from 2012 to now, has that revision done what we thought, or did it just push the number down from 45 feet?
Okay. My only confusion was the definition of a flat roof from the plate. I still don't understand why we arrived at that as a measuring process, because it's it just seems to me pretty technical and pretty confusing.
I feel like it was just an attempt to lower the building height allowed.
And yet, according to the staff, it encouraged
Sloped roofs.
sloped roof.
But it didn't.
Was that the intent? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm reading, everything seemed to have made sense except for that.
My recollection was, yes, in some ways, the sloping roofs were seen as more residential in character and more in keeping with sort of the greater character of the town. And that flat roofs were more massive in terms of the building form, and so
It was the shoulders. It was to push the shoulder away, so you didn't have big shoulders at the corner of the
But
building. I'm not saying good or bad, I'm saying that was the concept behind it.
No, I
That is-
know, but my gut tells me, like, if you make the roof line, so when you measure it from that plate, right, then a sloped roof now becomes taller or shorter. Confusing. I don't think it would. I feel like it'd have the opposite of the intended. Like everyone would just go flat.
Well, one thing
It'd be
we
interesting
learned
to
in
see what
general
happened.
is that if you provide a limit and you draw a picture of it, every developer who comes in will fill that picture. So we have to just be clear about what we want that shape to be. Because if you draw a line like this, they're going to do a building that's shaped like that. If you do a line like this, they'll do a building shaped like that. So that is a matter of economics. And so you establish what the limit is, and people will build to the limit. The focus that I think we need to do as part of our discussion is figure out what we want that limit to be. Because if we're looking for clarity and we're looking for consistency for people who come in to work in town, then we need to establish what our clear limit is. And then if people build to it, so be it, because that's what we've established.
Well, after we're done with the staff questions, that's what we're going to go. That's where
Absolutely.
we're going. My only other question, David, is, so they're not classifying a mansard as the mansard really is in the same category as a flat roof. You measure to the top of the roof,
Because there's
the top story roof, right?
Now it is.
Hmm? Okay. All right.
Wasn't always.
Okay, that being said, if there are no more questions, then it is incumbent upon us, as I read this, to review the changes, additions that staff put together on the ordinances, and to come up with something that we all, as a PTC group, okay, that's good, forgot about that. Well, let me finish, because we're going to get to that. And after, then come up with ordinances that we're going to recommend going back to city council. So after we're done with,
Let's hear what the public has to say.
let's see what the public has to say about this. And I'm in no particular order.
Can I just ask Scott one more question? Sorry.
Okay, yes, you can. Yeah.
Mr. Baker, have you had a chance to, given that you're new and looking at all this now, have you had a chance to review the zoning codes, and are there other, what kind of shape are we in? Are there other things that we should be considering the same time? What, just given these changes in how we're measuring heights or I'm just wondering, what's the piecemeal? Is there a piecemeal approach? Is there a holistic approach?
Well, you're looking at one component of the standards that go into building review and regulation. I think that, as I brought up in my recommendation for an alternate method of determining what the highest point of a building should be, there are a lot of different ways to look at that. And I think what the ultimate goal of the Planning and Transportation Commission is to make sure that buildings, no matter how tall they are, where the relation is to the property line, are the appropriate buildings for a downtown area. As I just mentioned, the height is one component of that. I see, and that's the question before the Planning and Transportation Commission this evening. I think one of the things that we will realize as we go into the visioning process is that, one, there's a lot more to what makes an appropriate building for our downtown and how that should be designed, how that should be regulated, how the building standards, design standards, and so forth should apply to that. And I almost want to say it's a little analogous to your discussion on the El Camino Real corridor, where you were looking at setbacks to rear property lines, the incentives that were provided for affordable housing units, along with some other items. And I think you came to the conclusion that it wasn't just a few things that you needed to look at, but rather a more comprehensive approach to the land use standards there. So I guess to answer your question, no, there's a lot more to be looking at. This is, the downtown building committee did spend a lot of time, effort, well over a year, looking at the regulations for the downtown, and they feel that their recommendation concerning the change of the height limit for the two CD and CDR3 zone districts is an appropriate way to go about trying to get buildings that are more in keeping with the character of the downtown and address some of the concerns that they've expressed and that I think some of our council members have heard.
Okay. With that, we're going to open public comments. Dennis Salem? How many minutes do you guys want? 3 minutes? Is 3 minutes good enough?
Followed by whom?
My name is Dennis Salmon. I've lived in Los Altos for 32 years, raised my family here, and most every day my wife and I shop in the village, so that qualifies me, and as a citizen, to have a strong point of view about all of these things. I also spent a year and a half on the Downtown Buildings Committee, and that qualifies me probably less than the citizen part of my background, but as you've heard from the staff reports, our committee, 10 Los Altons selected and appointed by the City Council, looked at the kinds of issues you're talking about tonight for over a year, all noticed public hearings. We had joint sessions with you, those of you who were on the commission at that time. We had joint sessions with City Council, and we came up with some very detailed recommendations, which we presented to the Council as well as to your body. The Council in May of this year directed staff to go forward with most of those recommendations with some refinements. That's what brings us to the Planning Commission. That's how the process works. So that's what you're looking at. I'm a little bit concerned, having been at your last meeting, that the number of property owners and developers that turned up perhaps exceeded the number of average citizens who were watching a game on TV that night. But I assure you from our work on the Downtown Buildings Committee that we took into account a great deal of public input, both at the public hearings that we held and from our direction from the City Council to listen to what our neighbors and citizens were saying. And I'll tell you consistently, what they were saying is this recent development under the zoning that was passed in 2010 is too much. It's too much density. If you build it out along the corridors on both sides of the street that you've got up there, you'll have a canyon. And those of us who are regular shoppers in the downtown village will feel that the village character has been lost. All the design guidelines, all of the zoning, all of the direction of the bodies then and now has been to try and preserve that character as best we can. So people who studied it decided that that the 2010 ordinance really was something of an experiment. It was a way to see if they could stimulate some development along First Street and thereby stimulate some more foot traffic downtown. It's had mixed results, but I can tell you this. At some of our public meetings, two of the council members who voted for that change in 2010 both said they didn't support it. They think it went too far. At the time they supported it, now they see what's come and the nature of the development, and they feel that our recommendations are a better way to scale it back somewhere in the middle to where it was before. There'll still be lovely development, but adding that extra 10 feet of commercial development height is not so far saved some of the businesses on Main Street. You don't see that there's any evidence that there's a direct economic correlation between that extra height and the vitality of the downtown district. So I would urge you to carefully consider these height recommendations and density recommendations as you go about your business. Thank you.
Thank you. Pat Boulay, followed by Joe and George Still.
I'm Pat Buells. I'm a resident of Los Altos. And one of the first things I just want to say is I was at the meeting, the last meeting, and I was really kind of shocked at the 4 and 14 discussion that went on and how the 4 were discounted because they were members of the building committee, but none of you up there acknowledged that the 14 all had a financial interest in the outcome, or almost all of them had a financial interest in the outcome of the decision. Really kind of surprised me. So at that meeting, it was said that Los Altos is at a crossroad. And I agree. There are those who are pushing for taller buildings and higher density. Before we go too far down the path, we might want to remind ourselves that this is the path that Palo Alto pursued. Yes, it attracted high-tech companies and employees and a bustling youth scene, but it also created traffic and parking nightmares that have driven the local Palo Alto residents out of their own downtown, along with much of the retail due to higher and higher rents. Is this the future for Los Altos? We're already starting to see some of this. I think we want to make Los Altos different. Let's try to keep it family-friendly, easy access village. This is why most of us bought our homes. I really don't think we want to build a wall, and it is about the height. Tweaking the materials, the finishes, and the setbacks aren't going to do it. You can maximize the profits for the developers, or you can have a village that the residents actually use and enjoy.
Pat, just a comment.
Yeah.
If you were here, then you probably, do you recall my saying when it came up that they were talking about a return on investment, that I specifically said that to take that off the table, that this had that the study had nothing to do with return on investment? I specifically said that to them. If you didn't hear that, I'm sorry, because I really made it a point.
Okay.
Thank you. Joe and George Estill, followed by Anita Yolanda.
I'm a resident. We are residents of Los Altos and have been here since 1975. However, we were here in the 50s. George's dad was one of the first elected mayors of Los Altos. So we were sitting sort of at their knees listening to the planning that went on for this dear town. And all of the people had come from the Midwest and the East Coast and large cities, and they didn't want to see that happen here. And so they were very, very careful in what they originally laid out. And I guess it's just bothering me terribly to see what's going on now. I commute now to the height and the density. I commuted the intersection of First Street and San Antonio for 41 years, easily, not now. I enjoyed the ever-changing view of our beautiful hills, not now, from many places in Los Altos. Traffic at San Antonio, Foothill, and First for 3 hours during the commute is a Category F. That is the worst possible in the county, and we're there already. Please listen to the citizens and don't increase density anymore by increasing height limits. The one goes with the other. Perhaps an issue affecting our town for years to come should be a ballot measure. The city fathers never planned a walled city. They worked so very hard to create a comfortable, safe community. Thank you.
Can I make a comment here also? Just, everyone in Los Altos, Commission, the City Council is quite aware of the traffic on San Antonio. The real problem there is that we're not really in charge of that. It's mostly, if you look at it, it's people that are going from 280, passing through Los Altos on their way to a much denser Mountain View and to a Palo Alto. And that's something that we toil with, is how is it that we can prevent their traffic from coming on our not only through streets, but on our less arterials. And that's a question that we're all struggling with. So it's, even if we had no density, not yet, George, I'll have you, even if we had no increased density, I'm not certain that the traffic would be any less, because it's not, we're a minute part of the traffic that's going on in San Antonio.
That's true. That's true. The corner of El Camino and San Antonio is one of Category F also.
George,
but
did
the
you
more
want to say something,
density
George?
that is put along that corridor.
You have to go
Up to the mic. Up to the
Go to the
mic,
mic, unfortunately.
Sorry, I had a stroke, so I'm not too well at that.
We won't judge you on your
I
dress.
remember that I wrote an article in the town crier and said that I was the one that prevented Squid parts for in the city. At the request of John M.R. Hope.
So
And
talk
George
into the
Sandberg
microphone so
Brad.
people can hear you at
But
home.
the point I want to make is that this is such a departure from the ideas of the founding fathers of this town, who created a town that everybody wants to live in, and property values increase. But this is such a departure from those ideas that I am really having difficulty with it. I don't see why a few investors should be able to do away with that. Thank you, Jerry.
Oh, you're welcome, George.
And I would welcome the opportunity to talk to you. And I'm sorry I'm
Just
not
look up my
better
telephone
dressed.
number. I would welcome the chat. Look up my telephone number in the through the website. I'd be happy to talk to you, George. Be my pleasure.
You may remember that Gardner Bullis and my dad got 280 moved up into the hills.
Mm-hmm.
It's considerable effort from themselves, but 280 has moved back down here.
Give me a call.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank
Now,
I will call you.
perfect, great. Anita. Great. Anita, followed by Ernest.
Before I start my remarks, I'd like for a moment to say, all the questions you have about what the real heights are on those buildings, I know what they all are because I sat with every one of those plans and I annotated the drawings and my own photographs of every one of those buildings so that I knew exactly what every height was. And I could answer all of those questions for you if you want, and I have my notes with me. I will also say that a number of the buildings that Mr. Cornfield said would become nonconforming would not be. But that's another story. I want to speak to you tonight and also to our residents because we are here on behalf of the residents. And everything that we did was not because of our own views, it was because of the residents. 2 years ago, a significant number of our residents were unhappy with what was going on, and they unseated a sitting council member who was running for re-election, which had never happened, largely because people were unhappy about what was happening. We spent many, many hours doing exactly what you were just talking about, looking at not just what the height numbers were, but why were people unhappy with those buildings? What was it about those buildings that they didn't like? What would make it better? And we looked at the survey, not a survey that we designed, a survey the City Council designed with a professional organization. It wasn't our survey. We just interpreted. We talked to hundreds of people. We walked with Mayor Satterley at 3 tours that she did with the citizens downtown, explaining about the zoning and what had happened. We listened to all of those questions and people's comments. We didn't have carte blanche to point to more intensive development on El Camino or the east side of San Antonio, or to tackle the parking issue, or how to manage affordable housing incentives. Our charter was to focus exclusively, as Mr. Biggs said, on the CD and CDR3 zones. We didn't do an economic analysis because we were told it's council's job, not ours, and not PTC's, to integrate economic issues with what the residents want. And none of the recommendations here that we've made are based on our individual opinions. In fact, they benefited, as Mayor Bruin said during your study session the other night, by having a collective thought and discussion. What really is the right thing to do? So what we came up with after those long hours was what we think is a middle ground for our community. It is not a return to the prior condition of 2010 by a long shot. It is instead a compromise. It retains the form-based zoning put in place in 2009-2010, and I regret that that wasn't put in your packet, because that change instantly virtually doubled the amount of square footage and mass that could be built on every lot in those districts. Doubled. It is unfortunate that you didn't have that background. So what we are proposing does not change that. It does pull back the additional increase in height, which was added on top of that, which almost tripled the square footage and mass. So what we're suggesting is that we simply pull back a little. We actually leave more square footage for housing than they would have otherwise had. We do cut back a little on the commercial. And we agree, by the way, with the City Council that we cannot wait for visioning, because implementing any changes from that process are at least 18 months in the future. And we've heard loud and clear from residents that they don't want any more massive buildings that are going to last past our lifetimes. They want this changed now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anita. Emma?
I'm happy to share my pictures anytime you want to see them.
Good evening. Yeah, Emmerich McDonald, local resident of the last 6-7 years. Raising a family, 6 under the roof right now. One of the things we love, a comfortable place to shop. Safeway has been a wonderful place for me to feed my family inexpensively. Easy to park, easy to shop, easy to get the groceries, easy to get home. We live a block off of downtown, and we walk into town all the time. We are looking for a great place to raise a family. That's why I'm here. In addition to that, I've made investment as a developer in the town, buying a parcel, looking at the possibility of buying other parcels, and looking at the possibility of development, thinking about what this town could be. I totally appreciate long-term residents who have enjoyed the last 40 or 50 years living here. I want to enjoy the next 30 or 40. Maybe I've got 40 in me. I think that some of the things I did hear about how important this is does make me think that it deserves a broader audience, and I don't know that that broader audience really has been heard. And the notion that Los Altos is at a crossroads, I truly believe Los Altos is at a crossroads. The competitive environment from a urban/suburban center, whether it's what's happening at San Antonio Center or in Mountain View or in Los Altos or Cupertino or Campbell or any of these places around, are drawing people away from a town that could end up museum-like in character, with its current 20 boarded up businesses on State Street and Main Street because they can't make it in a time when the stock market's at an all-time high, and we've had sort of 7-8 years of robust growth with 3 of the largest market cap companies in the world in Facebook, Google, and Apple within less than 10 miles of our city center. So for those reasons, I urge you not to pass any changes to the current ordinance. and allow council to more fully consider the views and desires of all of the citizens, and not just those that have been perhaps more inclined or better able to follow the political path to have influence on what some of those outcomes might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emmett. Are there any other public comments? I'm going to close public comments. Okay. So before we deliberate, you should know that we know, as do the people running for city council, that probably the two biggest issues in the city are height limits and parking. It's been that way for several years, and we get it. We understand it. And we hear it from both sides. I can't have breakfast in this city without someone coming up to me and stating an opinion. And they're not all the same. Some of them are pro, some of them are con. And they all have their reasons. So I just want to say that this is not an easy decision, and we're trying to make what we feel is not the best economic analysis. That has nothing to do with how we're going to vote. I assure you. Sorry. It has to do with the climate here in Los Altos. But at the same time, you've got to realize that Los Altos is going to change, just like every city in the United States is changing. It's changing because people are wanting to move, George, right downtown. They want to live here. 10 years ago, you couldn't. I remember the developer that built on the old post office came to my office and begged me to buy the land from him because he didn't think he could do it. And now, I'm sure he made a good amount of money because people have changed over time and they want to live closer to be downtown so they can walk and go to all the services. So when we consider what we're considering, we yes, emotional input is welcome, but we have to look at the dynamics of the city from how people are going to live and operate here in the future in an aging society according to what they want. So it's not an easy decision. So with that speech, let's deliberate. And we might as well start from the first one, I suppose, right?
Are we going to hear from the economic development?
You know, that was the piece. Like,
Push a button.
we asked the economic director to come, and I have like a lot of questions for her, and that wasn't part of our discussion. And I don't know if I thought it was going to happen later, but that's a big missing piece. So can we start that conversation? Can we ask questions?
You ready?
Okay, Jen.
Well, let's start. Now, you want to start?
No, I was going to say that's pretty much a staff presentation as to the economic perspective of what this all means, right?
I didn't see anything economic in when I read.
I know that.
So, can I just ask a question? You know, some of the things that we often hear, particularly when this discussion comes up about the downtown, is that it's had mixed results economically. Or, so I heard that tonight, or there's really no correlation between the development and improving energy in the downtown. And those anecdotal comments that people say all the time about the financial vibrancy of our downtown are just, in my mind, anecdotal. And like that information, it can only be substantiated by financial data that you have. And I feel like, can you describe to us from 2010 to as compared to now, are we in a much better place? I mean, can you really say there have been mixed results?
No, I mean, I have a very basic chart from our consultant. That the one I pulled shows from 2003 to 2015, and there's definitely an increase, particularly from the trough of the recession. But this particular chart that I have compares our downtown to other downtowns in the area, and everybody has seen a rebound. So the question is, yes, we're in a better place, but correlation, causation, it's hard to say. We've been in a period of economic expansion that has been happening everywhere. The way I describe Los Altos a lot of times when I talk about our economy is we are not the tide, we are the boat in the tide. We don't have an economic engine the way that Mountain View does and Palo Alto does, but we certainly benefit from fluctuations in those economies. So it's hard for us to really understand our growth and what's propelling that without those engines. And it's really foolish, I think, to say, well, because of the development in the downtown, the increase is due to that. Conversely, it'd be foolish to say the opposite, that if there's a flat line or it's just too dynamic of a system to kind of rule one into the other. That being said, from an economic standpoint, when you have more density and you have more feet on the street, you are going to see more economic vitality. That's just the way it works. There are trade-offs, however, as you guys have all talked about with Palo Alto. There becomes a tipping point where there's diminishing marginal returns. Once it gets to be too dense, well, then you start to lose some of the very basis that created the economy in the first place in terms of shopping and pedestrians. So I think a lot of us have been turned off to very dense places because you can't ever find a place to park and it's too crowded. And so there's a delicate balance. I think what Los Altos ultimately needs to strive to find is that balance. It's very clear from people who have worked here for a long time and lived here for a very long time that the downtown is changing. You are seeing more activity in the evening hours. You are seeing more activity on the weekends. We do have businesses that are a little bit more dynamic and progressive than there used to be, but we still have a lot of the same restaurants that have been here for 30 or 40 years. So that's kind of, my elevator speech about our economy, but I'd be happy to answer anything else. My favorite thing to talk about.
Is there any way to conduct a study of just the way Los Altos alone has been doing? Is there any way to measure that?
Certainly. So our data provider is really great about responding to specific data requests. Mm-hmm. And they're also very amenable to defining geographies the way that we would collectively agree to decide what that geography is. There's certainly ways that we can do deep dives into that. I've done a couple of studies independently, without direction, to look at the composition of our downtown, meaning retail versus office square footage, relative to sales tax, and compared that to other downtowns to see if the downtowns that have more office are more productive or less productive. So there's ways for us to kind of do analyses like that. The caveat, though, is what does it really tell us, and what's our objective? As I've said before, people can do whatever they want with statistics. So that's the danger of doing that type of thing.
Yeah, my question was, so when I thought of the other communities around us, and I think of Menlo Park, right, which is intensively retail downtown, has parking spaces behind. We seem to, in some ways, assemble the same kind of businesses. And what we're talking about is expanding from a retail-centric downtown to more of on the peripheral offices. And I can't think of, I think of Santana Row, where it's got some office, but they're retail. I'm just trying to think of places that have kind of office space, but it's a downtown-centric kind of thing. But I can't think of anything like that. And I'm curious, does the data you're talking about, is there any places that come to mind? I mean, I think of Los Gatos and Campbell. Everybody's kind of retail-oriented. I can't think of a lot of office space.
So Palo Alto is the example of retail that got lost to office space because they didn't regulate that to the degree that other places have, and so now they're struggling to get that to come back. But Palo Alto, it's a denser area, but they have way stronger sales tax revenue than we do.
Well, and Palo Alto has the Stanford Shopping Center. There are characteristics of Palo Alto.
Even with just the downtown core, excluding that.
Yeah. And there's no parking. That's the other thing. We've got this wonderful 10 lots, right? that
Wait a
people
minute,
could
they
park
have
in.
7 municipal garages, multi-story municipal garages. If you want to park in Palo Alto and you can't find it on the surface,
You can go
to the
upstairs.
garage.
Okay. I go all the
There's
time.
always a garage
Okay.
available. They
Right.
made really aggressive planning that if they were going to build a development, they were going to provide alternative parkings, and they went to the colored parking system so they don't have
Right.
workers, employees parking and taking retail spaces. So I disagree.
No, that's fine. I'm just.
I don't see how you can compare the dynamics, economic dynamics and population dynamics of Palo Alto to Los Altos.
Well, it's not,
I
we're,
mean,
we're
they're
an
not
apple
just-
and orange. That's
they're
not going
apples
to be
and
true.
oranges, so that's-
Because we've talked about this. I mean, Jennifer, this is the first time you've been to this group, but we've talked about the cities that are local that most resemble ours really are Los Gatos and Saratoga. Because, no, I'll tell you why, and let me explain. Because those two have the historic downtown core, even though Los Gatos was rebuilt after the earthquake, but they maintain that character, and they don't have the train. The difference between Menlo Park and Mountain View and Palo Alto and why they are bigger in many ways is because they can bring people in mass transit. And so that's a different thing. We have to have the ability to deal with cars, which is what Los Gatos and Saratoga struggle with too. They also have, in parts of the town, similar geographical distribution of lot sizes. They have the weeny ones in the older part, and then they have peripheral ones that are significantly larger.
Well, don't we have the same thing?
That's what I'm saying. That's why those towns have historically been used as an example of what we could say is similar to ours. But that's just, it's a statement of fact in response. But there was something you said, Jennifer, that I found very interesting, which is that there is a tipping point mix between retail versus office commercial. And is it something that's quantifiable? Is there some magic proportion that is something one strives for in public policy?
Yeah, there's industry standards that kind of look at composition of cities and try to establish those ideal ratios. The Urban Land Institute is probably the most predominant and awfully cited example, with office being the heavy percentage, around 45%, and then retail and residential kind of rounding out the rest of it. The reason why that mix works, and there's a lot of ways to study it and all of that, is because of the different times that the area is used. Ideally, what you want to have is a mix that there's, a lot during the day, tapering in the morning and the evening, but there's still the steadiness that residential offers. Not having the influx of what would be like just an office campus. And then the retail needs to be present enough, but it can't be predominant because there's not going to be enough people to serve it. But rarely do you ever have the opportunity to construct that from the very beginning. Normally, it's you come into a place and this is what it is, and changing it's difficult. So when the Urban Land Institute comes up with percentages like that, it's kind of like if we were to create something from scratch, this is how we would do it. There's towns that are successful that don't meet that criteria, that are more heavily retailed. There are towns that behave differently. So that's a standard, but that's not necessarily the way it has to be.
And do you know how we are now?
I have statistics. I'm curious if you agree with them. I mean, I got these from a broker's trying to market, in Los Altos. This is what when he's advertising retail, he's telling people this is what you can expect. He says that if the formula is 15,000 square feet of retail for 45,000 square feet of office and 40,000 of residential. That's the ULI standard, right? The gold standard. That if you had blank space, that's what you create. So when people say like, oh, we really want to be retail focused, you can be retail focused without having a lot of retail. Like you really don't. So in Los Altos, we have 46% retail. 25% office and 29% residential. Do you think those numbers are close?
Relatively speaking.
I mean, I think that's why we're seeing retail not succeeding at the degree that it's lopsided. So like when they, in 2010, when they set as their primary goal to encourage development of Class A retail space, really like composition management should have been a key component of that equation. And you have, like there's an area that here is multifamily. Well, if you want to have, if our housing is at, residential is at 29%, and it really ideally would be at 40%, then like how do you push it in that direction?
Well, when you have 10,000 square foot minimum parcel size and it's a suburban development, not very easily. I got the 29% residential. Would you say the other two numbers?
Office 25% and retail 46%.
46. Okay, thank you.
So how forward-looking is that? Because at least the shopping component of retail is going online, and it's going online quicker and quicker. So you're never going to get a manicure or a haircut cut from Amazon, but you can get pretty much everything else. So, I mean, really, are those targets forward-looking, or are they, this is how we've always done it? Because we know things are changing.
Even less than 50.
Yeah, that's where I'm going.
I don't know.
So that's really a question.
That's something that in the industry we struggle with a lot, because while things shift and the internet certainly became a game changer, a category killer, there's been irreparable damage to the way that retail behaves. No one's yet convinced that that's going to be a permanent thing. It's shifting with how we're behaving, but Amazon opening up 400 physical stores is kind of an example of we're never going to be entirely e-commerce, and I don't even think that the things that we buy from Amazon will continue to be that way. What we're seeing a lot in retail is the shift towards experiential retail, where people still want to go to a retail location. They don't just want to buy stuff, they want to do stuff, they want to be somewhere. So we're seeing retail shifting. You're still going to need the square footage that we have, but what it's going to look like is going to be different than what we're used to.
I mean, like retail service where someone goes to get art classes or music classes with their kids.
Right. And then the coordination between clicks and bricks is a very interesting idea, too, where one way that retailers were trying to adapt to everybody buying things online was to being able to offer services in addition to the online purchases. So I'm sure we've all been to a retailer where we can go try on a bunch of stuff, with the assistance of somebody, and then they will coordinate our online purchase for us. We're going to see more and more of that as retailers connect with e-tailers and create a new way of doing retailing. So the ULI hasn't shifted that standard. There's been discussions about it. Anytime I go to ULI conference, I always focus on retail, and that's one thing that we always kind of talk about. And then the other thing that we've talked about on the staff level is how progressive does the city want to be in terms of adapting to this change. Very rarely does the city want to come out ahead of a trend, right? So I think even if it's not entirely as forward-looking as it could be, staying with the standard like that is a safe place to be.
Now, can a city, because ULI, you're right, is imagining a situation in a vacuum, but can a city encourage a better composition without doing what Palo Alto did, was like, okay, we're going to allow more office. Perhaps at the time that's what they needed to, because they had so much retail, they needed to bump it up. Without like just having it be never end. Can't it be a gate that you're, opening and closing based on your needs? Like, if every business that is now shuttered, that is retail, in our downtown was no longer going to be retail, we'd still be like grossly overbalanced with retail. So, I think it's hard for brokers to remarket those spaces, because the first question a retail person's going to ask is, how much housing do you have and how much office do you have to support? And when you say 46% other retail, they walk away. It's not, they see the writing on the wall. So what are other cities doing to open and close in a more deliberate kind of way?
So Mountain View, one of the ways that they did that was, and I think we've been talking about this a while, is adjusted the parking ratios for restaurants so that they could encourage more restaurant uses.
And they sunsetted it.
Exactly. So that's a perfect example of an open shut door, where they and you have to remember too that the times when cities get reactive is tends to be when there's recessions and downturns, and I think that was part of the equation here. And so when you have a lot of vacancies, when you have issues like that, that's when cities start to get creative and say, well, what can we do to encourage? And they'll look at the pain points that tenants are voicing and try to react to that to fix it. The downside of any sort of reactive decision is the loss of predictability. Then it becomes difficult for future tenants to know what to expect or what not to expect. And it's also difficult for existing businesses and new businesses to look at each other and say, well, why were you allowed, but I'm not allowed? We have a perfect example of what's going on First Street, where Jeff Morris is looking across the street saying, but I want that use across the street. So it's a difficult position for us to be in a fluctuating place.
Right.
But the
But
zoning.
their tools are there.
What we're looking, the ordinances that we're looking at now are the CD/R3. That's going to take some retail off, hopefully, off the table and convert it to office, which is what we want to encourage. Now, typically an office is 4 people per 1,000 square feet. But in today, that was the old school. Today, trying to squeeze people in, it's probably more like 6 to 8 per 1,000 square feet. So if you're adding, just a 10,000 square foot building potentially puts 40 to 80 people downtown working who at 12 o'clock and at 5 o'clock and maybe for breakfast are looking for a place to walk downtown and eat and shop. So it seems to me that we're heading in the right direction. And the question that comes up is, how high do we want to be in that area? And I think that's what we need to, we have to get back. It's great to talk about philosophy, but we have to get back to these ordinances and decide how we want this to look. And just for a little background, after we had the meeting 2 weeks ago, I had a separate meeting with Megan because I could see her in the audience and she looked
Perturbed.
concerned. And so I called her up and said, Megan, let's talk. I want to hear your point of view. And so we met. And after that, I then had a meeting with John and David. And just like everyone else in Los Altos, we talked about height restrictions and how we could best approach it. And one of the things that Megan and I talked about is that maybe all things aren't created equal. And then and I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second, because I then took that philosophy to John and to David. What if we had, so there's lots of concerns about going too high. You're going to have that shadow effect. You're going to have the closed-in effect. And so when Megan and I talked, we talked about, well, maybe we ought to look at restricting buildings by how wide a street is in front of them. And the narrower the streets in front of them, the more setbacks that we could impose on the buildings in order to take away the bulk and the mass. That's A. B is that you have to look at the lot size potential. And this is often used in commercial real estate, that encourages larger lots to take over. If you're looking at where CD and R3 is, you might want to say, and I'm just making these numbers up, anything over, if a lot is 10,000 square feet or less, then you'll have a limit of 30 or 35 square feet. Because, otherwise it would look like a pencil. It would look like this going up, and no one wants that. On the other hand, you might, in order to encourage larger development, it wouldn't be office, you may want to say if a building has X number of square feet, then they could go to 45 square feet, because then restricting that bulk and mass to a larger area. I'm not saying we wouldn't have setbacks, because I think you need to do that in order to break it up. But so it doesn't have to be everything created equal. I mean, and I'm not making this as a law. I'm just looking at it as a suggestion as to how to go about it.
That's what John was saying, is that there are lots of different ways to looking at it. This is a very sophisticated issue, and one of the concerns that's come up is that height is a very critical one, but as the people who did this huge study and spent a year of their lives doing it, it's not the only one. And I think that's the being careful about, be careful what you wish for, is kind of what happened out of First Street development, in that the community was having trouble surviving in the downtown, and no one was willing to redevelop anything from the 50s. And we said, let's make it easier, and we did, and we got big buildings. And there's an equal part of the community that's as unhappy as the people who are happy. And that's why I don't envy the people who have the visioning, who were just hired to do the visioning for the town at the last city council meeting, because I don't think they realize what an anthill they've stepped in. Because it's one thing to say they did a really good job in Pismo Beach, but Pismo Beach was not split literally 50-50 between part of the town who doesn't want it to change significantly. I'm not going to say it all, because I've been in town long enough and I've been on the commissions long enough to say that when I started a long time ago in the dark ages when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I first was on planning commission, there was a significant part of the town who did not want two-story residences. And it was an issue that pretty much was one of the functions of one of the major elections when city council was up for election, because half the town was horrified that there would even be two-story houses, when in fact the original development in Los Altos had been two-story farmhouses. The interlopers were the ranch-style houses that came in post-World War II. And it was like, okay, we have the same problem in general, in that there is a part of the community that feels very strongly that large-scale development is inappropriate for town. And there's an equally vocal group who are sometimes stakeholders, and sometimes they are people who are not necessarily owners in town, but who believe that in order for the town to change, which it is going to, based on the economic drivers that we're talking about, there has to be orderly development, and that's basically what we're looking at. But this idea of looking at it a different way, I think, is in response to saying that looking at the height alone, and we've broke it into pieces because there's so many pieces, is the tough one, because it has been identified as the issue, which is creating canyons, blocking the view, giving shadows. But in fact, it is, I think, the tip of a much bigger iceberg. And that's why I'm so glad Jennifer came here.
Yeah.
Because when we talk about, people have said many times, we need more feet on the street, and that means people who live in town, people who work in town. And the CD and CDR3 districts are where we have the parcels that are large enough to do something. And so I think it's an uncomfortable position for PTC when council says, we have heard the study that was done. We thank our local residents who spent a lot of time and really put effort in on this. And they have come up with the following suggestions, and we should implement them. When then I go to the city council meeting as the PTC rep, and they say, we really shouldn't do anything until we have a visioning statement. We shouldn't commit to larger parcels, because if we don't have a visioning statement, how can we possibly make a decision? Fine, and then the visioning people are going to find that the town is bifurcated.
Right.
And what are we going to say? So this is to point out that if we're going to discuss this, I feel like we have a political hot potato here, because we have direction from council through John that we should vote on this change immediately, and they want to do it before the next election.
Right.
And yet that's out of one side of their mouth.
That
The
may or
other
may
side
not
of the
happen.
mouth at the city council, they're saying, well, here's this developer who's come in and said, I want to do this great project and I'm willing to spend money for a public benefit to get parking for the town as well as a park where we really need green space, and they're saying, wait, don't do that
That's
because
exactly
we need to
in-
vision.
That's exactly in response to what I was saying. That's called assembling. That
They have a 1 acre
that one
parcel.
developer that we're talking about took several small pieces. That's exactly what I was saying. That's called assembling, when you assemble properties in order to allow a bigger picture. Whereas, that's why, we're not going to be talking about 3 stories in downtown Main Street and State. Why not? Because they're all tiny little parcels. They're off the table. But the peripheral that we're looking at now, which is where the growth of cities should be, that's on the table. And I think we can't look at this as just black and white, because I would like to encourage assembly to see larger pieces rather than a continuation of State and Main on our main
But with that
arterial.
said, I have to say that I came to this meeting prepared to say we started last meeting by saying we don't support any of these. In fact, I don't think that's an appropriate response. I think the appropriate response is, if we don't have a vision in town, if we don't have a visioning process, why should we have us thrown into the ocean to make a decision when City Council is saying, well, we're not going to make decisions because we don't have a visioning process? Who made us the poster child to get shot?
We don't run for office,
I
that's
feel
why.
like this is, well, I know, we don't get the big bucks. There's a certain inappropriateness for us to do this when City Council has, in public, said that decisions should not be made until there's a visioning statement because the town is so divided. So for me, I respect the work that David and John did to pull this together. I'm glad Jennifer came to give us this point of view, but I look at this and say we can parse the words here, but across the general board, we had a consensus at the last meeting that except for tweaking some verbiage, we really couldn't support changing the limit. Now, City Council can decide what they want to do. We can recommend that we don't make changes. We could also recommend that, as they said, we would defer to them and would like to defer any work on this till we have the visioning process too.
Well, with the change in management coming to City Council
Maybe.
in November, there's no way that they're going to vote on this between now and November. No way. I don't think.
So, well,
Well, why is it getting?
why is the pressure on us?
All right, so
getting pushed through?
just let me try.
Spiel.
Let me build on that. I agree with that, but I want to make the point. I know and I'm sure the rest of my commissioners, we represent everybody in the town. And so I appreciate your point of view, but I know there's another one out there. I hear it all the time. And I'm going to give one analogy, and I'm not trying to offend anybody with the analogy. I was considering going on to medicine, and I read all the chat rooms, and everyone had side effects and how terrible it was. I said to my physician, and so then I decided to go on it anyway. It worked wonderfully. Hardly any side effects, feel great. I said to my doctor, well, geez, it's lucky I tried this. Everyone's on the chat rooms complaining about how they feel. And she said, well, because the ones who it works for are out having a life. And so, again, not to be offensive, but it's often the people who feel passionately against something that will take the time. And the people I run into in town like what's happening generally. Maybe they don't like a single building, but it's not about height. It's not solely about height. And I think this is back to then where Phoebe was going. So I think it's premature to pass another ordinance change to change the height at all when we know it's in flux based on everything that we're hearing with council and council's hearing. So why change it to then have to change it again? And I do think that this is a single point rather than the multifactorial approach that would be better to deal with what's the right development for Los Altos. And there has to be development. Change is inevitable. So I don't think it makes any sense to pass anything right now. And I do think that there's another contingent of the community who is actually very happy with the directions that things have gone. So that's my 2 cents, which corroborates Phoebe's 2
We shouldn't
cents.
sit next to each other at these meetings.
So wait.
Kick each other.
Well, I'd like to make some observations that just from this week, because I spent a lot of time thinking about this exact issue, and there are a couple of things that came out on the Tuesday night meeting that I thought were very interesting from the LACI folks, which said we have a large parcel on CDR3, and businesses there cannot succeed. We cannot succeed getting foot traffic to those perimeters at all. And I thought about that because when you look at what we're talking about, CDR3, and I recognize that Safeway and 400 Main Street are actually in the CRS district. I mean, what people complain about is something that shouldn't have been built in the first place if it was currently being built. But what we're talking about is the peripheral, the farthest points away from downtown. State Main Street, to me, represent the downtown core. And those buildings, and that's where everybody shops and where everybody is.
That won't change.
That's not going to change. But what we're talking about are the peripheral. And when we talk about I haven't heard anybody say the condo building's too high down on that one end of First Street. And I'm really interested to see what the other end of First Street gets done with the 3-story building that's being built there at 467 First Street, because it's right across from a 2-story building. And those kinds of things, I mean, I think that what's really needed is more feet on the street. We heard it from LACI. We need to put people to come down to these corners so that
non-retail
office space, so that we
it's
can
got to
get
be office
business.
and or residential.
Whatever,
Those are the
but
two.
the point was that what they said was, look, we cannot survive the current way we're at. And I look at like Round Table Pizza, and I go there a lot to buy pizza because I really enjoy their pizza.
Well, you've got kids.
I have no kids.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, but my point is this: if you go in that store, there is nobody in there. Any time of day, there is nobody in there. If I go to the hardware store, there are very few people in there.
Because they're door dashing it.
In the hardware store, they're one of the primary retail.
Exactly. This is my
always someone in
point.
there.
Is what you were saying, Jerry, with your pencil up in the air. You know, I think that we should provide some sort of height incentive. If people can conglomerate enough parcels like they did at 460, assemble
Yes.
enough parcels like at 467 First Street.
I was telling him that when I was
Because the burger place
Yes.
and the veterinary place and the empty lot
I'll
were
give a
horrible.
perfect example, and in fact, I said this to John. In the 80s, when I was working for Coldwell Banker Commercial Real Estate, if you recall, Mountain View, as a city, took a shoreline area that was mostly residential. We all remember that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we're going to make it office. Well, look at what it was. There was a conglomerate then of nothing but tiny, tiny parcels. So what Mountain View did is something that I think that's where I got my idea from. Is they said we're going to limit growth. If you buy a 10,000 square foot lot, you're going to only be able to go this high. But if you buy a 40, you're going to be this high. And if you buy and so what happened is that the big developers, Perry and Arriaga, Sobrato, you just name them, started assembling those properties in order to make them big. Well, who would deny the fact that didn't turn out pretty darn good, right? And you see very, very few tiny little office buildings. Why? Because the economics that we're all talking about, I'm sorry to see Emmerich leave, make more sense. And the dynamics of the city ultimately make more sense if you can make larger lots. So if I was going to vote tonight, and I'm so glad everybody doesn't want to because I was trying to talk everybody into not doing it, we shouldn't have a fixed rule that says everything's 35 feet. No way. How's that going to encourage assembling?
Right.
So,
Well, if the goal is that we want to encourage assembling, so that's the other piece, is that what you said is something that went by, and I want to ask my fellow commissioners to talk about this, which is when we're talking about, my flag that I wave every time I'm up here on the dais, is that the downtown core is really special. And it's got tiny lots and is the thing that is the village character and the reason that people want to be here. But If economically we want those tiny little stores to survive, the bridal shop and whatever else comes in, we need to have feet on the street. If we need to have feet on the street, I have consistently said we need to have larger development at our perimeter,
Right.
whether it's residential to get multi-story housing, whether it's office, but we need to get more intense development at the perimeter to protect and support our core. If that is a value that the other commissioners can support, then aggregating parcels is one way of doing it. Having the zoning reflect size of parcel or width of street or any number of things
Right.
is all part of it, because the width of street is addressing the concerns of a large part of the community, let's say half, who don't want a canyon effect, who want to have more open space. And as a sidebar, I kind of liked that proposal that we went to see at LACI, because if there's an empty lot that's in essence a park across the street from Safeway, and if the community unhappiness with Safeway is partially caused by the fact that it's very tight against it, an empty lot will provide a good breathing space so that you will feel like you go from a condensed space to a wider one to a condensed space, which is what Frank Lloyd Wright was talking about last century.
Well, and that's why, Phoebe, that another limiting factor isn't only the size of the lot, but it's also the size of the street. For instance,
The width.
the width of the street. I'm sorry. So you wouldn't be able to build the same kind of building on State Street or that you could on First Street, because First Street it's wider, it's wider sidewalks. So what you don't want is the shadowing and the canyon effect. So if we came up with a general everything's 35 feet, and yet some of it's on just
narrow street.
on a narrow street, how's that going to look? So it's too broad. We can't come up with just a broad statement that says this is what it's going to be, because there's too many limiting factors that I think need to be considered.
But I'd like to hear Alex say something, because he said nothing tonight.
Well, I wanted to finish with
No, and then I wanted to hear Bahi say something, because we all talk a lot. You guys need to talk more.
I'm with her.
which is the her.
On this group, there's a lot of hers.
There's a lot of her. Yeah, we're friendly here.
Well, I can go first if you want, Alex. That's perfect.
I can go. I wasn't here a couple of weeks ago, so I saved up all my energy to add to the discussion. As another architect, I think that's the perspective I'm going to present, because I don't want to repeat all that has been said. I also don't agree with changing the height limit, because when I look at those buildings in the packet and just walking around downtown, what I like about a building or not like about a building has nothing to do with the height. It's usually having to do with good architecture versus bad architecture. And so I don't think a dense building has to be a bad development. Density has a negative connotation, it seems, but it doesn't have to be. There's so many tools an architect has that he can use to, or she can use to reduce the feeling of cluster and discomfort around taller buildings. I mean, you could have some diversity, like you guys discussed, tall and, short next to each other. You could have some green space to soften the edges in between. There's setbacks. There's just, a lot of tools you can use to, soften it up. So I really don't think that, again, height alone is a factor here. So, in general, as we learned in architecture school, and the way I see the right way to go about for an architect is to analyze the site, gather information about the parcel, the neighborhood, the community, all that, and take all that into account into design. And I just feel like some architects are doing that really well and some are not. And, just because they meet the zoning code, they meet the setbacks, it doesn't make a piece of architecture a good one. And so I wish there was a way that we could hire better architects, but I know that there's legal issues and you cannot choose who a client picks. But as I've seen in other cities, what they do when they really care about, as we do, about the area of development in downtown, they would hire a board, an architectural review board, where there's a vision, there's some standards that we as Los Altans agree on, and that board will oversee any project that comes through. There's just so few projects, and they're going to be lasting forever. I mean, there's going to be years and years that we'll be looking at them. So it may be something to consider where, a group of architects, landscape architects, urban designers, people who, the city trusts, the people trust to, direct the architect that is designing these buildings to do it the way we want it, not to direct everything about it, but to make it fit the visioning process. Because when an architect is hired, they just usually a lot of architects want to just do the job, make money, and get out of there. A lot of people don't put the care that they need giving it. And as a commissioner that I've only been here less than a year, I feel like my hands are tied. Projects come in front of us, and I really see bad quality architecture, and we can only ask them to add a little detail here, a little detail there. They come back once, they come back twice. As long as they meet the code, they're going to pass eventually. So we really can make it good architecture. We don't have the tools, and I know the staff doesn't either, to make to make this a more beautiful city. It's just the draw of luck. Whoever the developer hires, hopefully, is a good architect. So that's my 2 cents. I want to make sure that even if this architectural review board idea isn't considered, that we don't look at it as just one piece. There's so many elements, so many tools we have besides just the height.
Alex?
I thought that was our job, so now I'm trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing. But I do agree. But look, maybe it's I'm new as well, and maybe it's idealistic, but I think we should be saying no as many times as it takes, because buildings are going to be here far longer than we are, and it's incumbent on us to make sure it's right, and not accept anything less than that. Being a principal in a development firm that is very high design and design focused, I agree. I think that there's just like in many different consultants, there's always good ones and bad ones, but just because bad ones come before us doesn't mean that that it should be something that we're willing to live with, especially because there are so few opportunities for development. And I, again, being involved in a firm that is very focused on design, completely agree that it's a confluence of different elements that make a great building, and it's not just height, and that we should, be looking at all of these things and studying, whether it's setbacks. I think we've got downtown and we've got El Camino Real, and we should be looking at something that is lasting and holistic and takes an overall approach to coming up with some good avenues for people to do, to develop and to solve for things that the city needs in a way that people that live here and work here can appreciate.
Well,
I just want to make a couple
I'm sorry.
points.
Oh, sorry.
And I'll do it in 60 seconds so we can still get out of here by 9. I think I gave all the reasons last time, but I think again for this committee it was only about the height, and it's not entirely clear for me that we even know what that height is, particularly after we had the initial discussion. And my second point is that I think that the use of the poll in the way that it was used, I think they interpreted the poll data wrong. And I don't believe you can say that a majority of this town feels the way this committee feels. But they continue to use that terminology. The majority feels this way. And just as Sally has talked to people who do like it, I think the poll actually shows 51%, but as I said last time, over 30% like 45 feet and 28% don't. So if you're going to look at that poll and rely upon it, you can't interpret it the way you want to. You have to interpret it correctly. I'd be happy to have a conversation with you offline. I mean, I'd be happy to.
Anita, please.
And then I think economic data is incredibly useful. But, you know, it doesn't sound like we can actually make the correlation or causation either way. So when people say it has no effect or it does have an effect, I'd like to actually see that us go a little deeper to see if there really is a correlation. But again, I think we have a situation of very vocal minority claiming to be a majority, and it's like kind of the Yelp effect where the people who are saying the negative stuff
But that's
are more
both.
vocal.
We've had business people come in and be a very vocal minority also. So I think it's the anecdotal aspect that I find frustrating.
But I don't think that they're like the people who are content aren't volunteering to be on committees to then revisit codes, right? So I think if you look at where we are today, in 2010, when these all went in effect, they were talking about like how do we incentivize redevelopment of First Street? It was like in a dire condition, and now only 6 years later, people are like, there's a certain percentage of people that are concerned about how it looks and frankly, I think the fact that you've got half the population of this town that actually like it means that number is only going to go up. I mean, if after 6 years people are half of the people in this town think it's okay, well, give it some time. Like that, we're actually in pretty good shape because I don't think that number is going to go down. I think it's going to only increase.
Ronit, I have an idea.
Yeah.
I was for an economic data point. It's a small one, but I would like to see actually Safeway revenues 1 year or whatever time period before they close for the remodel, and then the same time period 1 year after they reopened, and look at their revenues. And I would imagine they've had a drastic increase.
If they want to
in
share.
I was just going to say, I know this getting establishment level data is highly, highly confidential, and very rarely would anybody want to open the kimono to show us that type of thing. But we've tried to figure out ways to do things like that, even if it's a self-reported, because how else are you going to measure something like that? But even still, let's say that Safeway was able to open the books and we saw it. Again, it's really difficult to take out extra variables like economic conditions and things like that. So
one thing that I've been
I was going to say, what about the city generated revenue from the condo complex versus whatever there was before? Because to me, Safeway
was
there, and they built a building that we would now say is non-compliant based on our codes today.
But it's a wonderful grocery store, and lots of people. It's crowded there now. I used to shop there before, and I shop there after, and there's a huge difference. That's why I asked for that data point. I understand maybe we can't get it, but I think it was there before, but it's not anyway the same kind of beast.
But because it's 2 stories, does it mean that it's twice as productive if it was one story? Would it, and
Well,
it
the
was
cars,
parking
you don't-
underneath?
Well, it didn't,
Would
it didn't
I mean,
double. Well, it almost did double in size.
It did, so
Went
that's
from
why
20 to
I-
40, right?
But I think if you can't have anybody open their kimono, which I love that phrase,
I'm full of that.
I was for me the tag has always been if someone comes in and they sign a lease for a building for a year, and after a year they close. That to me is more significant than any of the other data points we can have. And so I'm always looking to see, for example, Chico's has been there now more than I think 3 years. And they're a national chain. If they weren't making their numbers, I think they would get out. Now, I don't know how long their lease was, so I can't put that as a data point, but that might not be as confidential.
We do have that data to some degree. We have CoStar data, which is the largest commercial real estate data collector in the country. Los Altos is a small town, and so the coverage of this town is limited. I've been working with them very strongly to increase that. That's one avenue of analysis that we could potentially work on because we can look at rents, we can look at vacancy trends, and things like that, and it's less confidential than what we would get from
Income.
our sales tax.
Because that is, I think, the essence of the town is that if your boutique and small-scale retail that is the charm and providing the services that you need, it's the shoe repair place, it's the ice cream store, it's not necessarily the anchors, but I'm talking about the little ones. If they're turning over all the time, we have a problem.
Right.
And if they're not turning over, then we are, or if they're turning over more slowly, then we are in some way succeeding.
So are you saying about the vacancy rate?
Well, I
The
think
number
I
of
am.
empty offices?
Well, but-
Because that's where my concern is.
Yeah.
There are a number of properties that, 170 State Street's a prime example where it's turned over. I mean, there's nothing open that I know of that's there, yet there used to be a lot of business, good or bad.
The thing that's fun about our downtown is, to us, it's like a cut on your lip. It feels really big to you, but no one else can see it.
Exactly.
Our vacancy rate is actually the lowest it's been in years,
I'm not a bit surprised.
relative
Wow.
to the recession, obviously, right?
Yeah. Oh,
yeah.
And relative to history. But to us, when we're walking up and down the street, we just see boards going up all over the place, and particularly right now.
Well, Earthworks saying 70% off everything you
Right.
want. I mean, it's like they're
Yeah.
a
With the
billboard
guy
out
with
there.
the spinning sign, oh my
Yeah.
God, get rid
Yeah,
of
and
it.
But also often it's like, it's a sign of what is to come.
I want to
Is it-
be
but
optimistic.
is it that?
but it's-
We've had a good
it's
run,
It's the
and-
rapidity of it. I mean,
Right.
Earthworks was there for
A
30
long time.
years.
But they
So-
said it's retirement, not the business.
Well, I
and the
understand.
kids,
Say, yeah,
you know,
that-
so
But the recession didn't start at the,
True.
you know, it
Exactly.
starts slowly.
But and I think this is all going to be part of the economic analysis that we do as part of the downtown visioning, because that is and will be a component of.
How long is that going to take?
Well, we're looking at coming back late next spring, early next summer, to have that wrapped up.
They were talking 6 months.
So to get back to the subject of what we're
So-
supposed to be talking about,
tonight.
which is the height.
Tonight's issue.
Do you need a recommendation from us to
Well,
give to
tonight,
City Council?
Tonight really is still a continued discussion. If you are okay with the language that I've proposed or the modifications to the other sections other than height, at your next meeting, I'll bring back the draft ordinances for you to consider. We'll have the public hearing at that point. You'll make a recommendation on those. And I think the term recommendation is the key. It's not that you are to agree or disagree. You're making a recommendation to the city council. It doesn't have to be the same recommendation that the Downtown Building Committee has made, the same recommendation that staff has made. You are at your discretion to develop your own recommendation onto the city council, whatever that might be. You may disagree with the Downtown Building Committee.
So if
You may
we're
recommend that other things be explored. There's a whole range of options to you, and will help you kind of identify what that.
And I want to
range of
piggyback
options
with
is.
what Jerry says, because this is where my head was getting, is the aggregation or assembling of sites that would dictate the height limit in some way. And I don't know if that's what you're saying that you'll recommend, or is that part of the conversation we have next
so
week?
actually there's two parts. So
weeks.
what John just said was, can we recommend something on the other items, other than height, based on the work that was done so far?
I have no
if we
problem with
can
that.
have a consensus on that, then we can have either a further discussion or not. We can demur on the height issue, and we can recommend that further study is needed and punt, basically, on that item.
The other items being just whether we
Well,
remove
definition
tower.
of tower,
2, 3,
definition
and
of
4.
semantics.
Yeah,
You're
it's,
saying.
it's wordsmithing, and I
And
think
5.
John listened to us whine last time and incorporated as many of them as he
I think he made a
could.
great job of it.
Yeah, I think
I'm
so,
willing
too.
to make a recommendation that we
Wait,
approve what he
but I
recommended.
I do have one point though on
Oh,
2E.
Go for it. 2E.
2E. Because you've added that actually, I think, really excellent paragraph in 3, the italicized paragraph, to me, 2E then becomes cupolas, however one pronounces that, chimneys, solar thermal and photovoltaic panels, blah, 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 not more than 8 feet. But you would take out the completely enclosed penthouses or other similar structures because you're addressing those in number 3. You can't say in
You can't have
2A
them
that they're 8 feet,
And then,
in number 3 they're
they're
12 feet.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Okay.
That change.
Cool. Good pickup, sounds.
All right, so with that deletion, beginning it completely and going through the building, comma,
Yeah.
then I'm fine with.
Okay.
So
And
do you
then
need a
we'll-
motion from us?
Well, not right now.
Okay.
I've got your direction. I think I understand that you're comfortable with this. At your next meeting, I'll bring back the ordinances. You'll make the
Perfect.
we'll hold the public hearing. You make a formal recommendation on the ordinances, and then decide what you would like to regarding height.
And you're going to bring pizza to that meeting?
Only from your paper
Okay.
pizza parlor.
Yeah.
Well, what's wrong with skips?
Or spot.
Come on,
I don't know.
guys.
Spots gets.
Okay.
Okay, next
Next.
item. Commissioner reports and comments.
I was at the city council meeting on Tuesday, September 13th. There were 3 issues that involved us directly. One was the 4880 El Camino Real development was approved.
Yes.
It was, one of the council people made great effort to point out that the increased height was not an incentive, but was rather a waiver for the 21 units. And there, it was, I think, a clarification so that, as we had talked about in another conversation with John, that we needed to understand if and how we could set limits between incentives and state-granted waivers, and so we could understand what the limits we could set, so that if someone said, well, I want 27 million feet, and we didn't have a cap on it, we couldn't say no. So that's still on the plate. Item number 6 was passed under consent, which was the annexation of Jordan Drive, which we had also recommended approval. And the discussion item was the Downtown Vision Consultant recommendation, and indeed, they did authorize $300,000 for that visioning, which very strongly emphasized that if they didn't have an economic analysis as part of it, it was not going to be accepted as a fulfillment of their contract. And they also talked about something we had talked about in another completely different conversation, the difference between 3D modeling on computer versus 3D modeling in real brick and mortar, so to speak, paper models. And the consultant who was selected said that they tend to do computer 3D modeling when they're discussing, here's option A, here's option B, here's option C, because it allowed them to be more nimble with the changes, so they could say, well, someone on council could say, well, what if it was 75 feet high in that area, and they could go whoop, and you could see what it looked like. But they did say once it got to a point where they felt they had reached a good status, that they would then build a true model for it. So that concludes my discussion.
Okay. Future agenda items, anyone have any ideas?
Oh, wait, excuse me, there was one more. Zach was there and presented the 180-day discussion about the planning application process, and that was approved as well. Excuse me.
Anybody want to add anything to the agenda?
You may want to introduce them to 3D printing. Makes it a lot easier now to actually see what these buildings look like very easily, and they just swap them out.
The consultants and
Great.
I have talked about that, so
Yeah,
that's what we're looking.
we do it all the time.
I would just to reiterate something I've continued to say: the good, the bad, and the ugly tour.
Oh,
David said he's working on it.
I know. But I just want to make sure that
Before it starts raining, David, please. Before it gets too dark.
Okay, I'm assuming there's no potential future agenda?
Well, we did talk about having that joint session with City Council to discuss who's making an alarm.
What am I making?
I hear an alarm going off.
Not me?
Coming from that way.
It must be me.
Guilty.
It's exactly what it is.
Charged.
Guilty as charged. I apologize.
Want me to help you?
I got to find it.
I just wanted to share with the commission that at the council's next meeting, the 27th of September, if I have that right, you did make a recommendation regarding the El Camino Real corridor and that they look to a more comprehensive plan. We're kind of taking a report to council as a discussion item to get their feedback.
At the city council level?
At the city council level, and share with them your
that's
recommendations and
interesting.
your review of that work.
Who's covering the 27th? Bahi.
Okay. With that, adjourn.
All right.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.